welcome everybody. It's so wonderful to see such diverse folks from different organizations, new faces and partners. My name is Jake Shapiro. I'm Program Manager for Democracy Initiatives at Interfaith America, and I'm so happy to welcome you. Just really quickly, we'll look at our agenda for today. We'll look together at the 2026 midterms context. We'll talk about our Faith and Elections Playbook and some updates that we've made. And we have a panel discussion with our amazing guest speakers. So with that, I'm happy to pass it off to Chris Crawford, Senior Director of Civic Strategies at Interfaith America.
Great. Thank you very much, Jake. And thank you to the whole team who have spent so much work on helping to update the Faith and Elections Playbook and make this webinar possible today. And also want to thank our panel and thank everyone who is joining us today for giving us your time and also lending us some of your expertise. The work that we do on elections at Interfaith America is ultimately about bringing people together and giving them resources that they need to support a more pluralistic country and ensure free and fair elections. And most of that is connecting people to each other and connecting people to resources beyond the reach of Interfaith America. And so just want to thank you all for your engagement and for all the work that you're doing. Really happy to be with you all today. And we'll get started with just some quick context on the midterm elections. And Jake, you can go to the next slide. It's important to note on the front end that as a country, we run free, fair, transparent elections. And this is not magic. It's due to the hard work of millions of Americans across the country who step up in their communities to serve and to ensure that we have free and fair elections. And any time that we start by talking about our elections, we need to start by affirming that fact and supporting those people and noting that we need to all do our own part to ensure that we continue to have free and fair elections. And so we want to start with the positive, understanding that there are also many risks to the system right now. And so some of these challenges that await us in the midterm election, there's going to be a lot of litigation. There already is a lot of litigation. We've seen different places trying to change their congressional maps. And while we don't have an organizational position on that, all we're noting when it comes to the congressional maps is that it leads to some of the facts of the election being up in the air and litigated in the lead up to the election. And so we want to just note that that's one of the things that's different about this midterm election versus the presidential election. We're always concerned about the potential for political violence and threats of violence against candidates or voters or our election infrastructure. And one of the big questions for this election is whether there will be immigration enforcement at polling locations. And even just the threat of that could have an impact on voter turnout or voters feeling safe at the polls. And so we want to call that out. And then also, we're always concerned about false information or confusion leading to apathy or disengagement or seeing potential for voter suppression. And we also are concerned, especially in recent elections, about attempts to overturn the results by subverting election laws or certification rules, or if it is a close race in Congress, refusing to seat duly elected members. So these are some of the challenges that we're seeing. At the same time, we don't want to point to these challenges in a way that is going to lead to disenfranchisement or lead to apathy or a huge amount of frustration that will cause people to just check out. The fact of our elections is that they are run by everyday people who take this seriously and are well trained to lead their communities through an election. And so the best way to push back on some of the challenges in our election is to get involved and encourage other people to do so as well, especially people with whom you disagree. One of the best ways that we can model pluralism is by joining together with people who might vote differently from us or have different politics from us and say, let's work together to spread accurate information about our elections, get involved, recruit poll workers, and do the things together that we need to ensure free and fair elections. We also want to, on the front end, affirm the process and the rules and educate people on what the processes are, all the ways that it's transparent, all the checks and balances that exist. And then also, once voting starts, ensure that these rules are upheld. No matter your politics, all of us can agree that the laws and the rules need to be followed in our elections. And we also want people to come together, faith leaders and their election officials, to learn about the specific needs in your community and how you can help. And then ultimately, we want to be vigilant and address these challenges and do it in a way that's empowering people and giving them agency, rather than leading with fear. Even though I think a lot of us are frankly operating from a position of fear right now because that's a natural thing to do. And there are reasons to have some fear, but we want to transition from that to giving people the agency that they need to vote and to ensure free and fair elections. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. This is oh, okay. I'll just read this from Aaron, our good friend at A More Perfect Union. The work of A More Perfect Union with Jewish communities is actually one of the models for what the Faith and Elections Playbook grew out of. And so wanted to read this from our friend Aaron about our work through the Faith and Elections Playbook is about ensuring that the Jewish community is not just a participant, but a leader in advocating for fair and accessible elections for all. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Scott to just do a quick overview of the Faith and Elections Playbook.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for being here. This is kind of serving as, and we're delighted to launch the updated Faith and Elections Playbook for 2026. And I'll note also that the Spanish language translation is coming and will be posted on our site in about a week or two. As Chris was just explaining, elections by their nature are polarizing. We are literally choosing winners and losers. And because they are so charged with difference, elections are a wonderful opportunity to practice pluralism, where we respect, relate, and cooperate across our lines of difference for the common good. And when I think about, in the case of an election, the common good is working together, as Chris just described, to ensure a free and fair election process that protects and promotes voting access for all. And we believe in that work that faith and conscience communities play a unique role, and that the Faith and Elections Playbook is a resource hub for faith and civic leaders to find ways to engage in elections in ways that aligns with their values, their skill sets, and the needs of their communities. So we've said a couple of different times that we're updating the playbook for 2024. What does that mean exactly? Not a lot of big updates, but the updates are meant to help narrow and focus the activities and the types of activities that we and really national election leaders have identified as the most important and effective. So first, we did remove one activity. If you're familiar with 2024, you won't see it in 2026. It was the section on helping faith-based communities think about how they can offer their space as a polling location based on feedback from election officials and from playbook users in 2024. This was not as an urgent a need, and so we wanted to narrow the focus on these 5 activities you see here, and provide some resources to do that. So I'll just walk through these briefly. Really, as I said, the changes was to help people be able to focus on these 5 activities. We didn't want to overwhelm leaders and users with a lot of repetitive options or long lists of resources. So we pointed to resources and potential partners that have proven to be effective. So just in terms of addressing polarization, we think that elections present a wonderful opportunity for bridge building conversations in communities. So that you'll see the playbook has conversation guides and points to resources from experts in how do you help host and bridge those conversations so people can come together with their congregations, their communities, or across religious divides within their community around the election. Sharing trustworthy information or accurate information is critical. So the playbook, the activities described, equip faith leaders with information on where and how to vote and support them with innovative ways to share that information and get out the vote in their communities in a nonpartisan way. In terms of supporting voters to have a safe and positive voting experience, we are working with Dr. Barbara Williams-Skinner and Faiths United to Save Democracy on recruiting poll chaplains and peacekeepers at polling locations. These individuals are trained and can provide a calming presence at polling locations to help voters have a positive and peaceful voting experience. The training this year includes training on local election laws, also training on de-escalation. And we're really excited to partner, as I said, with Dr. Barbara Williams-Skinner on this national effort to get as many poll chaplains and peacekeepers out there as we can. Recruiting poll workers is always an important part of our elections. As we know, they are run primarily by people like us, just volunteers in their community, and we're working closely with Power to the Polls to recruit poll workers in districts that have the greatest need. And then the final activity that the playbook talks about is meeting with election officials, creating strong relationships between religious leaders, community leaders, and election officials helps to ensure that community members are receiving accurate information and that election officials feel supported by pillars in their own community. So I'll just close by saying, as I said, elections are a time of enormous pressure on our civic institutions and our leaders and communities. And because of that, they provide a truly concentrated moment to help leaders and coalitions come together across lines of difference to advocate for pluralism and for the issues that we care about through pluralistic practices. So the Faith in Elections Playbook is designed to help leaders and communities do that work. And we're looking forward to hearing from the panelists today about their work in 2024 and how they plan to use the playbook as a tool to activate their communities this year. Back to you, Chris. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. And yes, now we're going to switch to our panel discussion with Harman Singh from the Sikh Coalition, Ria Chakrabarti from Hindus for Human Rights, and Ray Shackelford from National Urban League. And they are among many of you who I see in the chat who have been a part of our network, either as voted sacred fellows and or as people who have been implementing projects through the Faith in Elections Playbook. So what we want to do for the next portion of our time is to just hear from them about their organizations, the work that they're doing, and especially around elections and in partnership with Interfaith America. So I'd love to just start with each of you to just share with the audience a little bit about, let's just ground this in who your organization is and what work you do on democracy and elections and pluralism. And Harman, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Interfaith America team for inviting us here. My name is Harman Singh. I'm the executive director of the Sikh Coalition. We're the nation's largest Sikh civil rights organization. This September will actually mark our 25th anniversary. The organization was founded post 9/11 in response to hate crimes, and really the need for legal defense and a collective voice post 9/11 for the Sikh community. And so we've worked to ensure that Sikh Americans can practice their faith freely, whether that's in schools, workplaces, courthouses, and in the ballot box. And we do this by providing pro bono legal services, by doing policy work at the federal and state level, engaging educators in schools to reduce bullying and to increase awareness about the Sikh faith and community, and through direct community involvement and development. Our democracy and pluralism work directly flows from our core mission as a civil rights organization. And Sikhi is a fundamentally egalitarian religion. The concept of ek onkar, or the oneness of all people, for us is not just a spiritual principle, it's also a civic one. Ultimately, we believe that democracy that does not hear from Sikh Americans is an incomplete democracy, and that Sikh political power, built through registration, participation, and leadership, is really inseparable from the Sikh safety and belonging in this country. And so our GOT work, our policy advocacy, and our civic education programs are all expressions of that conviction.
That's so powerful. Thank you. Ria, why don't you tell us a little bit about Hindus for Human Rights?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. I'm Ria Chakrabarti. I'm the Senior Policy Director for Hindus for Human Rights. Our organization started in 2019 in very much a direct response to democratic decline in India. So our scope has always been a bit more global as far as what we're looking at around human rights and democracy. And really because it seemed like so many of the people in the Hindu American community were both, concerned about threats to democracy here in the US, but cheering on attacks to democracy in India. And there had to be like a place, we thought, or our co-founders thought, where there could be Hindu Americans who care about democracy in both places, coming together to kind of advocate credibly for human rights, pluralism, democracy. So these ideas that Interfaith America are talking about around pluralism and democracy are very core to the way we work. It's not just the political work and the policy work that I do, right, around human rights and civil rights, but also the work that our cultural organizing group team does around what does it look like to be Hindu in all of the diverse ways. How do we communicate to different audiences? How do we make sure we're pulling out like all the many ways to be Hindu? I think being Hindu is an inherently pluralistic experience. And so all of our work flows from that, right? And because of that, the democracy work that we do is deeply ingrained into just the thesis of how we approach Hindu identity. Concretely, this has been voter education here in the US, and also talking about strategies that have been used to undermine elections in India, democratic backsliding outside of just elections, because democracy isn't just what happens at the polling booth, but attacks on free press, freedom of expression, the right to protest, all of that, looking at democracy very holistically. So that's the work that we do. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Ray, we'll go to you next to tell us a little bit about National Urban League.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ray Shackelford. I serve as the Vice President of Equitable Justice for the National Urban League. We are the second oldest and largest civil rights organization in the country. We turn 116 this September. When we were born, it was primarily focused around housing, jobs, education, and while we continue to provide those direct services to our communities in 36 states in Washington, D.C. through our 93 affiliates, my team, or my division specifically, was born out of the murder of George Floyd. So this was in 2020, and specifically to provide more support to our affiliates when it comes to civic engagement, advocacy, and public policy. And so when we think about, our conversation today around protecting democracy, pluralism, it very much feeds into the work that we do when it comes to civic education and civic engagement, making sure that our community understands the process, is actively engaging, but also through our nonpartisan Get Out the Vote campaign, which is entitled Reclaim Your Vote. This is a campaign we've been running also since 2020. We actually, and we'll get into this part more later, have partnered with Interfaith, but the connection is so strong because, especially within the Black community, when you talk about the faith community, leveraging things like Souls to the Polls, and that is still the largest aggregation when you talk about the Black community in terms of trying to reach them. And so, tying those two together, we've seen a lot of success when it comes to working with our partners around this topic. And fortunately, Interfaith America is one of the best places and vehicles to do so when you talk about engaging democracy and people coming together around this topic. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation today with my colleague and Chris.
Great. Thank you very much. And I do want to invite folks who are watching, if you have questions, we'll have about 20 minutes for question and answer at the end. So we invite you to put your questions into the question and answer box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. That should be available to you. And Ray, I want to go back to you. Your organization received a Faith and Elections Playbook grant during the last election. And I'm wondering what your experience was like. What was the project that you used that for? And if you could just let us know a little bit about how that worked for you.
Yes, we were able to fund several affiliates between Wisconsin, North Carolina, I want to say, was it Georgia or Michigan? But in that, we focused on a few areas, poll worker recruitment. We also focused on partnering with trusted voices, especially county and election officials, but also the faith-based community. And I would say the latter two, we had a great deal of success. Especially, I remember the event that we had in Charlotte, North Carolina, with our CEO, Robin Hamilton, where we were able to partner with not only a local church, but also the election officials there. And so, we had an event that was open to the community. It was family friendly, so there were activities for the kids. There was food, of course. I think that's an important note. That is always a good care to get people in the room, is to make sure that they are fed. And it's also something that's a part of faith when you think about breaking bread and fellowship. And it allows, conversation to happen much more naturally. But we were able to bring in, like I said, our election official, introduce him to the community for those that didn't know him, help them to understand what the process is going to look like, meet his team, and, had a very successful event. It was very well received, not just by the community, but by his team as well. We were able to, have a very good engagement. So that's just one example that I felt like was important to highlight of a success that we had the last time that we engaged with you.
Thank you for that. I think there's something important in there about building relationships early and being in conversations early with your election officials, potentially with law enforcement, with other community leaders, so that if there are crises that come up, there are already relationships of trust built throughout the election process, and you're not cold calling your election official. And you have the information that you need and the relationships that you need on the front end. So I think that's a great example. Harmon, the Sikh Coalition also got a Faith in Elections Playbook grant during the 2024 election, and your work was also featured on our Faith in Elections Playbook podcast that we did at Interfaith America. I was wondering if you could give a quick overview of your experience in the last election.
Yeah, so the last election cycle, we really centered our work around three target groups, and that was Sikh youth, new voters, and then obviously previously registered voters who need to be reactivated. And the playbook did a really great job in terms of giving us a framework to test different approaches across all three of those groups. The flagship initiative that we launched last year was our first inaugural Sikh Civic Engagement Fellowship. And what we did is we brought on 6 high school students and college students from across the country. So our fellows ended up being from California, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia. And we put them through a 6-month program, really combining civic education, GOTV skills training, and community organizing within their local communities. Obviously, Sikh Coalition is a national organization, and so the ability to have Sikh youth at the local level engaging their own communities through resources and support and training we provided proved to be really helpful. The fellows dedicated maybe 5 to 10 hours a week. They participated in workshops on voting rights. They hosted voter registration tabling events at the Gurudwara Sikh houses of worship. They engaged their local Sikh student associations on college campuses. And they also hosted a speaker series featuring Sikhs who are in government, politics, other civic leaders, to kind of both learn from them about their experiences within the government system, but also like what can they take away and how can they be inspired by the work others are doing. So that fellowship really proved to be one of the best vehicles for us to actually connect with Sikh communities across the country. The fellows, particularly when they tabled at Sikh houses of worship, were able to provide language accessible resources to community members in a very vetted and trusted way, especially at a time when there was a lot of misinformation and concern around how the election would play out. And so, in developing resources with them and then having them be the spokespeople within their own communities, really was a phenomenal experience, I think, for us as an organization. Alongside the fellowship, we also did text banking, door-to-door canvassing. We had seniors write handwritten postcards in Punjabi and mail them out to different likely Sikh voters. We did that in partnership with Dr. Tom Wong at UC San Diego and the Rise Together Fund. We sent voting text reminders to 45,000 Sikh voters across 16 states. We produced a ton of GOTV literature in Punjabi so that people understood their state level regulations and rules and when they had to be registered, if they can do early mail-in voting, etc. And then we also worked to set up a Punjabi language voter hotline if folks did have issues with voting. So all of this work proved to be really both invigorating and exciting for the young folks that were engaged in it. And we really try to do a generational approach. So, we heard from one of our volunteers that there was a group of seniors who really wanted to get involved, but maybe didn't have the capacity to do the canvassing and other things. And so in their small group, they just spent a ton of time writing postcards every week in Punjabi, encouraging others to vote. And so try to find both things for people, regardless of where they are in their life and the time and capacity they have, ways for them to get involved in doing this work with us.
Great, thank you. Something that stands out in the framing that you gave there is you use the word with a lot. There's a lot of bringing people together across lines of difference, across generations. And I think that's a powerful example of bringing people together and also meeting people where they are with language access, with making sure that they know the rules in their specific communities. So I think that's a really great example. Ria, you are one of our newer Vote is Sacred fellows. And I'd just be interested in you sharing just what it's been like to be one of our Vote is Sacred fellows, and how your work on the midterms is going so far as well.
Yeah, so it's been great being in these cohorts, meeting people like Ray and others. Of course, I think Harmon and I know each other quite well because we are in many coalitions together, and it's always great to be with I think the SIC coalition and all of these things. I always feel like we're always learning from each other, sharing things. I personally benefit from that. Like for us, we thought it was really important to be in this fellowship because really there are only a handful of Hindu civil society organizations out there. And I think we're truly the only organization that is credibly dedicated, like in its DNA, dedicated to democracy, right? This is a really important part of our work. 2024 was a really big year for us for elections generally because there were three South Asian elections and obviously the presidential election here. And in the 2 years since then, a lot has changed. What I've really appreciated with this, 2026 cycle has been like the fact that we're talking kind of honestly about what are the challenges to the elections, not just at the ballot box, but like people very worried about what happens the day after, the weeks and months after, and really figuring out how do we educate people about what happens once their vote is cast, how is it counted, who's counting it, where does it go, how have those things changed as well. We're entering, you know, in the next few weeks, voter laws might change. Um, and having kind of a cohort of people who interact with all the people who are most directly affected by those potential changes in the laws. And if they don't change, right, let's say in places like Georgia, which is a place we are planning to do a lot of work, there will be additional restrictions on people's vote. And so having a cohort of people where we can share what has worked in the past and also figure out this new uncertainty together is really useful to me. Um, and it's been a good group of people to talk about, okay, what may have worked in 2024. We have to reevaluate our approaches to democracy in 2026, just based on, again, all the changes in the laws and the information. What do we reevaluate now? How do we get ready for what happens in 2028, 2030, whatever, beyond, right? So it's been a great experience so far.
Great, thank you. I want to also remind folks, if you have questions for our panelists or about the Faith and Elections Playbook or the Vote is Sacred Fellowship, we welcome you to ask questions in the Q&A. I'd love to hear from all three of you on either your 2024 work or your 2026 work with the Faith and Elections Playbook. What's gone well, and what are some of the challenges to implementing some of these programs? And Ria, I'll actually go right back to you and then to Harmon and to Ray.
So, I mean, our plan has been really to lean into the pluralist DNA of HFHR and the ways in which we do interfaith work and do bridge building activities, particularly in Georgia. Georgia is a place where the South Asian community is becoming increasingly important and influential, and across faith lines. I mean, the South Asian community in general is becoming more polarized across faith lines. So it becomes more important to build these bridge building events, restore trust between our communities, and help people navigate, I think, a very difficult election year. So that's like the thrust of what we're looking at. And there are many multi-faith and interfaith opportunities to come together. We also want to bring faith leaders to meet with election officials. I think Hindu faith leaders often stay away from politics generally because it becomes really dicey for the community. And at the same time, they are leaders with like a lot of trust in the community. They are community leaders. So helping them meet with election officials so they can share out information to the rest of the community is crucial to us.
Thank you. Harmon, go ahead.
Yeah, obviously, I think we want to continue to expand our fellowship, grow our volunteer network, deepen our presence in key states. So we'll have more students, more engagement, all of that will be happening. I do think one of the things that we are thinking a lot about and also planning for is the reality that the current political climate in this country is going to lead to increasing concerns among members of our community about their safety when they go to vote, whether they still can vote given conversations and information that's spreading around immigration statuses. We've already started to talk in terms of if there's immigration enforcement at polling sites, how is that going to impact the ability of folks to be able to make it to the polls, regardless of their immigration status? If they're worried about how they may be targeted based off of their race or religious identity, how will that be factored into the pre-work that we do to educate folks about what their rights are and how they can report concerns or discrepancies as they occur? So I think a big part for us is actually building that faith part of it. Like, how do you have faith that you can go vote without being targeted or without being picked up and detained? And so a lot of our work around building trust and providing resources in a trustworthy way where frankly, people are not gathering their information from WhatsApp groups or TikTok, but they're actually hearing from vetted resources that are researched with a legal team, like exactly what they can do and how they can do it. Whether that's early voting, whether it's mail-in voting, whatever that looks like, if they have concerns, what are the options that are available to them? And so I think in a major way, we will be increasing that groundwork before the election to make sure that there is trust in literally, can people actually go to vote without facing targeted harassment and discrimination at the polling sites? So I think that'll be a big newer addition to some of our work this year.
I'd love to quickly follow up on that because you're getting at something that is one of the hardest things about planning for this cycle, which is this balance between trying to make sure that we're thinking through contingency plans and potential challenges, especially around immigration enforcement, while to make sure that people can overcome the challenges that might arise, while also trying to make sure we're not doing it in a way that causes people to stay home out of fear, whether there's immigration enforcement or not. And some of the conversations we've been having with diverse groups of election experts and faith leaders is there's sort of a divide in some communities of some people saying, don't talk as much about some of the challenges, just focus on the positive. Otherwise, it can end up accidentally suppressing votes, or talking more to organizers who say, you don't need to tell my community to be scared. You don't have to worry about them being fearful. They already are. So we have to give them the resources they need to overcome that. And I'd love, Harmon, to hear some of how you're working through that balance, because it really is some of the hardest conversations I've witnessed around this topic, especially for faith communities.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's something that we grapple with and we have grappled with over the past year in particular when there have been rumors of ICE enforcement at houses of worship, when there's been misinformation spread about targeted. And the thing that we've always balanced is in some cases actually having to say, no, this did not occur, but it could occur. And that's a really hard conversation to have sometimes that there's often this extreme of either folks that are believing and everything they're seeing and hearing on social media and saying all of this must be true. And then there's another extreme of folks that say everything is fine, nothing is going on. You guys are trying to create worry and panic for no reason at all. And there is like somewhere somewhere in the middle between those two extremes where it's yes, there are really awful, terrible things that are happening, and we've seen it, it's documented. We have clients that are experiencing it. We've talked to community members that have gone through it, but also we have to kind of look at the bigger picture and see whether this is happening in every single instance, or is this something that we need to accurately determine whether or not these things are happening at the scale that we're talking about. So I think part of what we would do and part of what we often do is like, how do we educate people to find trusted sources where they can actually vet this information? How do you find when stuff just doesn't add up? As a part of the Vote is Sacred Fellowship, I met some folks from MWEG, Mormon Women for Ethical Government. I've been following their page, and it's really interesting. They have like a series of ongoing posts talking about how do you actually look at a media source and determine if there's accurate information in there, if it's hyperbole. Like, I think those sorts of conversations are really important to equip our communities with the tools to actually accurately determine what are you looking at and should you trust this as a baseline source. So I think part of it is that. And then the reality, I think, from a community culture context is within the civic faith, and this is one of the advantages of working within faith communities is we can pull on philosophical and historical examples of how to approach this that's deeply embedded within the Sikh psyche. And so there's a concept in the Sikh faith of being tayar bar tayar, ready upon ready for anything that can happen. Um, and so that doesn't mean that you come with panic, but it means that you are ready for what could happen. And so I think pulling on what are the concepts that people understand within their bones, what are the concepts that they have heard in their lives, and using those to kind of educate is where we try to start, where you should be ready because that's part of our ethos as a Sikh is to be ready for anything that can happen, but you don't let that readiness turn into anxiety or fear and deter you from doing the things that you ought to do.
That's so helpful. Thank you. Ray, what are you seeing that's working well, and what are some of the challenges in implementing some of these plans around faith and elections?
Well, I'd say that, for us, even going back to 24, what worked well was really leaning into our existing infrastructure. And so what I mean is the fact that, whether it's housing, workforce, our entrepreneurship centers, et cetera, we have a lot of different ways that people come to the Urban League. And so making sure that we leverage all of those different direct services to engage them around voting. Making sure that they are registered, if they have questions, connecting them to the appropriate person so that they can get those questions answered, having ongoing conversations in those spaces. One example I can think of is that when I used to work for a local affiliate in Houston, I would actually go around with the head of our education department to different schools as he was talking to the parents and students about literacy. And he would give me, 15, 30 minutes to go up there and talk to them about the importance of voting. And a lot of times we were very diverse groups of people, primarily from the Black, Latino, and immigrant communities. But it gave us an additional opportunity just to engage them and answer those questions. And so that is something we'll be leaning into again. But I think to a lot of the points that Harmon raised, there's a lot of challenges this cycle. And the reality is that, and we knew this was going to happen, even as these attacks are happening within the immigrant community, it's also allowing them or giving them space to now attack Black community and pretty much everyone, leveraging federal law enforcement, immigration. And so we have proactively already started to lean into partnership and collaboration, coalition building more heavily. So we have some agreements in place with legal organizations to make sure that people will be protected where we have a presence across the country when it comes to election protection. And, God forbid something worse, but we will have those attorneys in place, but also through our work with our partners at ADL when it comes to the Community Safety and Solidarity Coalition. We're also working on a kit that can be deployed to our affiliates when it comes to educating our community around, what does a secure election look like? How are you making sure one another's protected? How you should be engaged during the time period. And also, matter of fact, yesterday we had a meeting with the Center for Countering Digital Hate around the topic that Harmon was referencing when it comes to, how do you differentiate what's real and fake? I have, unfortunately, a cousin that's always sending me something, and I'm just like, where is this coming from? And when we really start to research and dig into it, 9 times out of 10, it's not substantive, it's not real. And I think we get to do a better job of training people to not be into the, like and share, just automatically just take it and push it out there, but actually examine it. Take a second to do a Google search. Is this something that's consistently popping up across multiple reputable outlets? What is a reputable outlet? That has gotten more challenging, especially with the influence of the billionaire class when it comes to media. That's a whole other conversation. But to the best of our ability, we are proactively, like I said, educating people, putting these tools and partnerships in place. And the last note I'll say is that we're also entering into a national agreement with a faith-based organization to lean more heavily into the faith community. And so partnership, coalition building, pluralism, all these things are going to be very critical to our success this cycle and going forward.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to come right back to you this time because one of the last questions I have as I continue to invite folks to keep putting questions in the chat is what do you see as the role of people of faith and conscience in supporting our elections and making sure that we're promoting pluralism throughout our election process? And I'll start with you, Ray.
I think, it's really leaning into, I think, the teachings of Jesus, from a love perspective and bringing people together. I think that is why Interfaith America, one, is such an important organization. The fellowship that me and my colleagues are in currently, bringing us together, all these different faith perspectives, because in a time where there's so much polarization and so much division across the country, faith is one of the things that can bring us together. And so I think that is the role that the faith community must play. They have to be a convener. They have to speak up, where they see right and wrong, and really just make sure that they're continuing to help people to really understand the teachings of the Bible and lean into those things. Because, like I said, the things that are being pushed into people's minds, into their atmospheres, the energy is just not good, to put it mildly. And so I think if they can bring us together in that way, in partnership with organizations like ours that are represented here, collectively, again, we can identify solutions to not only bring us together, but make sure that everyone is engaging in this election and making sure their voice is heard.
Thank you, Harmon. Ria, do you have anything to add?
I'll just say, for us, from a purely practical level, our engagement around voting begins at the Gurdwara, the Sikh house of worship. The Gurdwara is the center of Sikh life, right? Both in terms of spiritual practice, but also education, political education, community discussion and conversation. And so for us, that's where we start, right? Mailers and text banking, phone banking is all fine and well, and there's room for that within the work we do. But our work begins at actually engaging within our Sikh houses of worship, obviously in a nonpartisan way, but in a way that connects directly with communities where they are. And I think the thing that faith traditions provide uniquely for this issue of democracy and pluralism is answering the why, um, and why these things matter and why we should care about whether or not our country descends into authoritarianism and fascism, and why we should care about whether there's pluralism, and using examples and histories and teachings from our own communities to be able to bring that out has always been kind of our starting point, especially when we're talking about very difficult, controversial, hot button topics, is like, how do we ground it back into the basic philosophies of our faith that everyone here can agree on? And then if we all agree on this, then let's see what are the things that we can, from that baseline grounding, maybe agree to disagree on, if that's what it comes down to, but we at least have a baseline understanding of where we start.
Thank you. Ria?
I think my comments are going to parallel Harmon's a little bit because I think South Asian communities or Hindu communities are kind of modeled in a very similar way, where temples are a really important place for community gathering. And it's not just like as a religious place. This is also often a place they'll have a community center. People do like music school, dance school, languages, right? People are learning their culture at the same place they're going to worship. And it's often the same leaders. Maybe the wife of the priest is like having language classes, right? These are all people who are part of the community and also building the community around the temple. We've seen that this is a place, because that is such an important part of the community, this is also a place where we often end up doing a lot of our organizing around like community safety. We have a Know Your Rights training that we do at temples. It's also oftentimes important to us to make sure that these are interfaith events that happen. It's often, or sometimes depending on the temple, a little bit easier to do interfaith events at the community centers attached to temples. because so many Hindu events end up also being like cultural events or religious events that overlap with other South Asian religions or cultural events for other people who are either in the South Asian community or the diaspora. Um, and then, philosophically, like, I think for us, it's often really important, like Hinduism, at least the way HFHR and those of us in HFHR think about Hinduism, is an inherently diverse religion. And so, how do you, like, in that sense, there's no consensus about like basic understandings of the universe across Hindu traditions. And so, explaining why is democracy important, why is pluralism important is really just, well, look at the fact that like you're a Hindu in this way, this other person is Hindu in another way. How can you reconcile those things? It's just an inherently pluralistic faith tradition that we can just say, well, you're Hindu, and that is the easiest way to justify in some ways why you should care about democracy or pluralism.
That's really helpful. I'm learning a lot while moderating this discussion, so I really appreciate that. We have a couple of great questions in the chat. I wanted to add a note. One of our questions is from a friend at Mormon Women for Ethical Government, and I want to bring up something that they've contributed to the development of the Faith and Elections Playbook that I always try to remind folks of, which is they made sure that everything in the Faith and Elections Playbook was designed in a way that lay people can take the actions. This isn't just something for clergy. And as we're having conversation as about faith leadership, I think a key thing around ensuring free and fair elections is giving people agency. And I don't think we need to be narrow in our definition of who is a faith leader. I think we have to be expansive and say, if you are someone whose spirituality draws other people to turn to you for guidance, you are a faith leader. And in the eyes of Interfaith America and who can use the Faith and Elections Playbook, you are a faith leader. And so want to affirm folks to really not limit whether you are in a position to engage with this playbook or in this broader work. With that, I'll pivot to, we have two questions in the Q&A and want to invite people to keep asking questions as they come to mind. The first one is, we've talked a lot, especially about the challenges facing marginalized communities. Is there something that those of us who are not in marginalized or threatened communities can specifically do to help? I think whoever wants to jump in on that, if there's anyone who really wants it.
I'm happy to start. This question reminds me of like a phrase I've heard, I feel like from like during the BLM protests, this was a phrase of like, how can white people be an accomplice, right? Like, spend your privilege, right? Is to put yourself in a place where it's not a risk for you as someone from a not marginalized community to do something, whether that's, help monitor polling stations in parts of a city where there likely will be an ICE presence, right? Or it's putting yourself in some kind of risk or a position that would otherwise make a marginalized person more at risk, right? If there are people who can kind of interfere with law enforcement, for example, not like interfere in that sense, but like, create a sense of safety for voters in a line, do that. If you're in a place where there are long lines and it's legal to give people food and water, do that, right? Things that make it easier for people in tougher voting areas to be able to vote, whether that's physical safety or meeting their physical needs. That I think is a substantive or concrete way that you can help. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
was gonna say, Chris, just to build on that, I think that continuing to lean into what Ria was referencing when you talk about privilege and access to help those marginalized communities. Also, when you do look to engage in your local community, don't come in with a lot of assumptions. Really just come in with an open mind and seeking to learn and understand, to see how they need to be assisted, and the role that they want you to play. Just like anyone else or any other community, there aren't monoliths. So just because myself or Harmon or Rhea may say this is what you should do, when you're on the ground, they may feel differently. Sometimes it may be financial support. Sometimes it may be potentially putting yourself on the line, as Rhea was speaking to. But I think just having that mindset and genuinely wanting to be helpful and build a relationship, and I would say start early. Like, don't wait until we get to the fall. Chris, you mentioned this earlier when we talked about relationship building. Go to those communities now. Hopefully you've already been engaging in some way, and if you haven't, that's okay too. But I think if you are just authentic, that's very critical, and open-minded, then you should be received pretty well.
Really important. Thank you. Harmon, anything to add on this? All right, thanks. We have one other question in the chat for now. We've got time if people want to keep following up. This is a great question that I think is carefully worded, that you could take it in a few different directions. How are each of the panelists thinking about navigating the ways that religion can sometimes be weaponized by bad actors during an election cycle, either to scare specific religious groups into voting for a specific candidate or to discourage people from showing up to vote at all?
I'm happy to start with this. I'll be honest, I think a lot of the intra-community conversations are sometimes the toughest rather than interfaith conversations, because what can be extremely frustrating is looking at someone who comes from the same faith tradition as you and asking, how do you come to the conclusion you come to that is the complete polar opposite of the one that I am coming to? And so there's a degree to which there is even more frustration, more anger, more disillusionment when you see someone in many ways using what you believe to be your faith tradition in a way to harm others and using your faith tradition's name to do so. And so I think those conversations are very difficult. For us, for me, that's part of our role every day, is to talk within our community about what are the things that we need to challenge ourselves on, the assumptions we're making. If we're demanding certain protections and rights and freedoms, are we also acknowledging that other communities are having those very rights denied? And are we willing to step up for them at the same time? And so I think it's a really good question and a difficult one, because it requires really deep inter-community conversations that can really oftentimes put people in a defensive posture, because it becomes very personal when it's a debate over how you are interpreting your faith tradition and using it or not using it in certain ways. I will just give some credit. I mean, I really inspired by the work of Hindus for Human Rights and this topic particularly, because the work of inter-community challenging and pushing people and prodding them in certain directions and really challenging assumptions and not allowing certain people to be the sole representatives for your religious community is really hard and puts you in really difficult spots, and they've done a great job. So I'd actually be curious how how Ria's approaching it, and then Ray as well. Just like this is one of the tougher conversations that we often have.
I'm glad to jump in because I think part of what Harmon is alluding to is like a dynamic that is very dominate, like in the community, if we define it like geographically, like where we trace our roots, it is, I think, the conversation. So this is a conversation we've been having for many years now, right? And I think Hindus for Human Rights is very much like in existence because of this dynamic, and that is the fact that there are people who weaponize rising anti-Hindu sentiment to tell people, like, to scaremonger them about who they should or should not vote for. And sometimes those people are also individuals who end up not being credible advocates for the Hindu community, and at the same time then go to other people outside the Hindu community and kind of say, we're the advocates and you need to care about anti-Hindu sentiment, and we should be the people you talk to, right? That's kind of the way they've laid it out. And oftentimes those same actors are actively either kind of identifying people within the South Asian community or the South Asian diaspora, especially either Sikh or Muslim Americans, as either threats to the Hindu community or kind of trying to make appeals to parts of the political spectrum that may harm us, right? And so our work has been the way we've been able to navigate a lot of that has been one to kind of show the data that a lot of people who, I mean, we have two pieces of data that we always pull out. One is that 66% of Hindu Indian Americans are concerned about the rise of Hindu majoritarianism. So that shows like that the groups that kind of represent that other side of this intra-community debate are not the majority. And then also on another really important issue for all, all of us around caste discrimination, that most Indian Americans 77% of Indian Americans support a federal ban on caste discrimination. And the more we talk about like the actual issues where I think most of us are aligned, whether that's around intra-community things or things like immigration, right? And voting rights, that's when we've seen more people be really like almost open to feel like they can talk to groups like us. Sometimes the dominance of or the loudness of bad actors makes it seem like they're a dominant voice, but then once you lay out the numbers of like where are things and also here's concretely what we are advocating for, it makes people feel like they have a space to come to, and that has been really helpful. The last part I would say is I think having partnerships with Sikh Coalition with our Muslim American partners has also made people feel like they can come to HFHR as well and not feel like there's something weird going on. Like it is helpful to know that there are partners that we have who we are working with constructively across faith difference, which makes it easier then to work across ideological difference within our community.
Great. Thank you, Ray. Anything to add? All right.
They covered it pretty well.
Great. We've got a couple more questions. One, I'm going to take a little bit of moderator's privilege to answer, but we'll invite other folks in as well, which is a question about, are any of you preparing for post-election chaos or attempts to overthrow election results? If so, can you share plans and recommendations? And I'll just say, in my previous role, when I was at Protect Democracy, I staffed the National Task Force on Election Crises and worked with a lot of faith communities in preparing for potential election crises. And one thing at this stage, as we're sitting here in April of 2026, is that one of the best ways to prevent an election crisis and to prevent and be prepared for the chaos is to get people involved early and making sure they have a plan to vote and they have access to voting, and making sure that we are doing what we can to build relationships with election officials, build relationships with candidates so that we are spreading accurate information about the elections and ensuring that we're doing all we can to have a free and fair election whose results are respected. And the more people we can get involved in the election process, the more people will feel agency and ownership, both in the election being run smoothly, and also you'll be in relationship with people who are in a good position to take action in the post-election period. That's why also that I think a pluralistic approach and a bridge building approach is helpful in some of these things like meeting with election officials and recruiting poll workers, whether they're going to vote the same way as you or not, is the more people we have who have agency over the process, the harder it would be to get traction in trying to overturn the results of a free and fair election. I also would say, just a plug for the National Task Force on Election Crises and the work that they do to educate the public on what the potential pain points could be and how to prepare for them. They provide very sober information on what the threats are and how to respond while also trying not to overstate threats. I think they do a good job of the balance that we've been talking about trying to strike today. And then the only other thing I would say is do the work to find like-minded people, especially people who have expertise on things like the post-election process, groups like the Brennan Center, Protect Democracy, and others. Um, One thing that I saw in 2024 that I think we want to avoid a little bit in 2026 and moving forward is I think a lot of us feel so much lack of control over some of the things we're scared about in the post-election process. So we think we have to go down the rabbit hole of every election law and every rule and every potential scenario of how many seats could be won by either side and what that means for the rules when the election gets to the House of Representatives. I think that we all need to focus on where we can make an impact now and throughout the election and know where to turn for experts. And I can commit to you at Interfaith America as well that if you stay connected with us, we're going to continue to be a part of that preparedness network and try to make sure that we're all as well educated and prepared as we can be, while also focusing on the front end, making sure we have a free and fair election and good involvement across the board. Anyone have anything they want to add on that? I even welcome you to disagree with me if you disagree with that assessment, but any of you want to add anything?
I think the only thing I would add, Chris, is for us, and I was actually talking about this on another panel last week at American University. The thing that, in my opinion, that I've seen that has allowed us to maintain some level of democracy has really been our legal system. And so even when it comes to the threat of, the source of the question, again, it goes back to our partnerships with legal organizations, especially within the civil rights community, knowing what types of approaches they may try to take, and ensuring that we are prepared to engage in litigation if it comes to that. But I think we're more so focused on the task at hand and still being mindful of the potential things that we will have to engage in after the election, because it is a reality. And I spoke to the students when I said this. I said this to the students when I spoke to them. We have to continue to remind ourselves in the community that these are not normal times, and that the things that we are experiencing and dealing with are not normal. So we have to prepare accordingly.
Thank you very much. I see one more question in the Q&A box, and I think it's a great question to end on, which is if there was one single thing a person could do to make a difference this election season, what would that be? Why don't we go Rhea, Harmon, Ray, and then I'll close this up.
God, I don't know. I would say learn what the rules are for voting where you are and then share that information with one person.
Yeah, I mean, Ray and Chris, you all kind of hit it. There's a lot of smart people doing a lot of work focused on a lot of the worst case scenario planning. That doesn't have to be everyone. So like the doom scrolling and like deep research, that doesn't have to be every person, right? Like there's experts that are doing this work every day with the right qualifications and backgrounds and expertise. If you can find the three people closest to you and give them accurate information and encourage them and prompt them to do the same thing with the three people closest to them, that's probably the most effective use of anyone's time.
Yeah, I would say, just to build on Harmon's point, make sure that you as an individual are as educated as possible on what's going on with your local election and share that information with everyone you know. We are in a time where all of us have the ability to get on social media and have reach beyond, our parents' and grandparents' time where everything was in a newspaper or, a carrier pigeon. But the reality is that you can literally reach millions of people potentially in a second. And so lean into that. But I think the key is, like I said, first, make sure you are as educated as possible and share that information.
One thing that I would add to this, and I think those were all great answers, is that part of the design of the Faith and Elections Playbook is that we don't at Interfaith America think we have the answer to this question, that there's any one answer that applies to everyone who's tuning in. This is designed so that you can think about what are, as Scott said earlier, what are your values? What are your skill sets? What are the needs for your community that you can address? And so we are trying to help each of you who are connected with us to discern what's the one thing that you can do. I just want to close by thanking our team for putting this webinar together, thanking our panelists. Again, I love when I can learn a ton of stuff while hosting a webinar or being on a panel, and this was a rich, rich conversation. So thank you for engaging and for the work that you're doing every day to support our constitutional republic, protect our democracy, and protect communities. And thank you all for tuning in. And we look forward to continuing this conversation throughout the election and beyond. Thank you.